you can try and put whatever words into my mouth, Matt Goodwin's mouth, but the simple fact of the matter is that the scale of the population change and the scale of the makeup is unlike anything that these islands have ever seen. You point to London, I would argue that, you go around places like Tower Hamlets and you see the Bengali on Whitechapel, you'd already start to see people taking themselves into their own sex rather than walking along the street and seeing each other as one another and part of a common nationality.
I mean, as everybody says at this point in the conversation, have you actually walked down Brick Lane lately? Are you remotely serious?
So today on the Flip Side podcast, we are talking about immigration. And this has become one of those issues that seems to touch on everything. Our public services, our politics, our sense of identity. I've always been drawn to this debate because, like many people, I've seen it from more than one side. I know people who've come to the UK in search of safety or a better life, but I've also spoken to people who feel that change is happening too fast and that their communities, even their country, no longer feel familiar. That's why I think it's really worth listening to both sides of the argument. When Keir Starmer warned not so long ago that the UK risks becoming an island of strangers, it struck a chord, or struck a nerve, depending on your point of view. Some saw it as playing into divisive rhetoric. Others felt it was finally acknowledging something they'd been feeling for years. So what does this all tell us about where the public mood is and where it's heading? To help me unpack this today, I'm joined by two guests with very different takes. Jonathan Porters is an economist and longtime commentator on the benefits of migration. Robert Bates is research director at the Centre for Migration Control and focuses on social cohesion and public attitudes. They don't speak for everyone, of course, but they do help frame some of the key questions in this debate. Hope you enjoy or at least find value in this debate. So I'll start by giving each of you 2 minutes to set out your position or framing of the issue. Then you'll have the opportunity to question each other and respond to points of disagreement. And then I'll ask 1 or 2 questions as well. Okay. So Jonathan, if we can start with you.
Sure. Let me start out by saying what I'm arguing for. Not high immigration, that would be silly, it can't be defined, but I would make the case for an open, liberal and flexible immigration policy. The case for liberal migration is essentially the same as for free trade. Like free trade, it's win-win, and the same logic of great British economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo on trade applies to the movements of people. The commentating class here, and I suspect most people listening, rightly regard Trump's view on the economic benefits of tariffs as not just misguided or wrong, but obviously mad or stupid. And politicians who claim we'd be better off with zero migration or closed borders should be afforded pretty much the same treatment. And we've got some pretty good empirical evidence on this as well. Migration boosts growth. That's obvious. Doesn't make it richer on average. In the short term, that's basically driven by 3 things: whether migrants are more likely to be of working age, whether they're more likely to be working, and their earnings. There's a lot of misinformation about this. We actually have data. We have data from the tax authorities on both employment and earnings. We know that, on the whole, recent migrants are more likely to be in work. Average earnings of people who are born outside the UK, whether they're from the EU or not, are slightly higher than those from people born here. So yes, migration does add to prosperity overall. It also adds more in taxes to the treasury than it takes out in spending. And there have been numerous studies showing that higher migration reduces the deficit. This is simply what the data says. It's not rocket science. There's a consensus among serious economists about this. What about the long term? Things are more fuzzy. There's more scope for disagreement. But again, the evidence we have for the UK is pretty positive. We know that sectors and areas with higher levels of migration are more productive, and it's that drives long-term growth. There's genuine serious debate among economists about how big that is. We don't know how much of it's down to migration, but among serious researchers, as with trade, the debate is essentially between those who think migration is moderately positive and those who think it's very positive. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you for that, Jonathan. And Robert, could you just let us know your thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, so thanks for having me. I should start by saying that I actually think the framing of this debate is somewhat redundant in 2025. I actually think the debate between expansionists, those who want net migration to continue running in the hundreds of thousands, actively want it to do so, and those of us who want numbers brought down quite dramatically, has been won pretty convincingly. So much so that 85% of the population now want net migration to be running in the tens of thousands or lower, and nearly 50% want it at net zero or lower. And I think we got to this point because the British population weren't actually listened to, despite voting for lower immigration for the last 15 to 20 years. They've been ignored. I think individuals such as Jonathan, actually, who have an ideological commitment to open borders, have held the ear of successive governments. I think it was in the early 2000s, Jonathan was writing reports for the Cabinet Office arguing, with no basis at all, that most Brits regard immigration as having a positive effect on British culture. It's an absurd claim, but one which was effectively the basis of New Labour's kind of immigration policy and their desire to rub the right's nose in diversity. And they've been proven wrong consistently, arguing, for instance, that mass migration would boost GDP per capita and productivity. Well, we've just had a period of hyper mass migration and GDP per capita has been in freefall. Our country's productivity is in the bottom half of the OECD. I think we're now at the point where expansionists are forced into arguing pretty much against the evidence. Jonathan recently claimed that 1 million foreign-born individuals claiming working age benefits was fake news. In a way, he was right, but only because the situation is actually starker than that. 1 million foreign-born individuals are claiming universal credit alone, and that's before we even get into housing benefit and other such types of working age benefit. He also dismissed the fact that foreign nationals claiming 7.5 billion a year in universal credit was simply not true, despite it being literal DWP statistics. But again, I suppose he's right in a way, because foreign nationals aren't claiming 7.5 billion a year in universal credit. They're claiming 1 billion a month, even higher than my side of the argument thought. So the arguments against mass migration are clear. We've got over 1 million foreign nationals economically inactive. That's not including students. Up to 12 billion a year going to foreign national households and universal credit. Low-wage migrants are a net cost at every stage of their life. 1 million individuals in this country speak little to no English. 48% of social housing in London is occupied by foreign-born individuals. Foreign nationals were convicted of up to a third of sexual assaults last year. We have inter-community conflict on our streets, and that's before we even get into the scandal of the rape gangs, which we're only just starting to learn about.
Thank you. So just to summarize before we go to the quick fire questions, Jonathan, so you, of course, are not arguing for an unlimited immigration, but you do believe in liberal migration, which you feel is a win-win for all. As a whole, you believe that migration does boost growth to the economy, especially short term. And you have given us some data that shows that migrants on the whole add to the prosperity of the country. They add taxes to the treasury. Long term, of course, you believe that there is still some debate here, but overall, migration is good for the nation. And Robert, you've mentioned that 85% of the population want migration, net migration in the tens of thousands. At least 50% want zero net migration. You've countered arguments that immigration has positive effects, either economically and socially, and you believe that British voters are not being listened to. So, Jonathan, what questions would you like to ask Robert, just to clarify his position or challenge his points of view?
Okay, well, Robert cited a lot of statistics which are simply wrong, and too many for me to actually go through, but essentially pretty much everything he said was invented, and he lied about my view. Let me be clear, lied about my views. I've never said I was in favor of open borders. You can read what I've written over 25 years, and I never have said that we should have open borders. So I think it's unfortunate that this debate is often clouded by people who are prepared simply to lie. If Robert wants to quote anything where I've ever said that, well, I think we should have open borders, he can. He won't find it because I never have. It's not something I've advocated for. So I think it is very unfortunate that we should lie. But let me focus on a particular statistical thing because I think it's a good illustration. Robert, and because we have Robert's words on paper here, it's his blueprint for mass deportations from the Senate worked out with Robert Lowe MP, and it says that we should deport 1.2 million illegal immigrants. Now, that 1.2 million figure is based on the upper end of an estimate from the Pew Center. That 1.2 million includes a large number of people who are not illegal immigrants. It includes people who are legally resident in this country with indefinite leave to remain. Now, Robert knows this because I told him it on GB News. He also should know it because the Pew Centre has retracted the 1.2 million number and said that they mistakenly included people who were legally here with indefinite leave to remain. That was published before Robert published his paper. My question to Robert is simple. Did Robert simply not know that this figure was wrong and that Pew had corrected it when he published his paper with Robert Lowe? And if so, should we take anything that he says on this topic remotely seriously, since he can't be bothered to do the most basic research? He's quoted something which has been retracted, or did he know that the figure had been retracted and simply lie when he published his paper with Robert Lowe? It's a pretty simple question, Robert. Which is it?
Is that to me or Robert Lowe? I don't know who he
sorry.
is.
No, Rupert Lowe. Sorry.
So, first of all, we've never debated illegal immigration on GB News. I don't know what argument you've imagined we've had on that. Second of all, the paper we did with Rupert Lowe, we weren't beholden to that 1.2 million figure. That was literally just a guideline and a framework of the scale of the problem. I think most people agree that the framework of illegal migration...
It's literally the first sentence in the paper,
illegal migration is between 800,000 and 1.2 million. And the purpose of that paper was to set out some of the guidelines through which individuals in government could start trying to remove those that are here illegally. So I think you might be a bit too fixated on a top line number that we simply used as illustrative of somewhere.
It's literally the first sentence in the paper,
and
Robert.
Furthermore, shall I answer it? And furthermore, of course, this was a paper that was published, I believe, in 2019 using 2017 figures, something like that. So we have, of course, seen huge levels of illegal migration since then, not just on the channel, but in terms of visa overstays. We know that about 8% in some instances of individuals aren't actually having been recorded as leaving the UK. Now, of course, a lot of them will have done and simply not been picked up. We don't do exit checks, so we're not able to determine precisely. But again, the very point of the debate on illegal migration is that we don't know the true scale. So it could very well be that Pew actually accidentally fell upon the truth or not. But I think we all agree, Jonathan, and I'm sure you'd agree, that it's in the high 100s of thousands, the illegal migration population at the very least.
I have your paper in front of me.
Before Jonathan,
I have the paper in front of me. Yeah.
Sorry, Jonathan. Just before you come back to Jonathan's point, though, Robert, shouldn't we really be, prudent in making sure we have numbers completely accurate? Because this is actually what the public is using to sort of come up with conclusions or decide how they feel about immigration. What do you say to that?
But Ada, how do you accurately count to the single number how many illegal migrants are here? It's simply not possible, because by the very nature of being illegal, we don't have a record of whether they're here or not. So the 1.2 million figure, I think, is now quite widely used anyway. I don't think it was just us that uses that figure, but I also think that, we have a huge problem when it comes to our illegal migration crisis. And, maybe it's not quite 1.2 million exactly. I would argue it probably actually is, given that this was a paper published a while ago. But we know that we're round about 1 million illegal migrants in this country. So, I think this is a bit nitpicky, and it's a peculiar question to have opened the conversation with, quite frankly, because, as I said, the purpose of that paper was to really set out a bit of a skeleton framework as to how you go about removing those that are here illegally, and it kind of used some of the literature that had been published and made some suggestions on the scale of the problem as a kind of indicator of why this was an important conversation.
Okay, thank you,
well,
Jonathan.
I agree it's a bit nitpicky, but I'm just saying the first sentence in the paper is: research by Pew Research suggests that there are between 800,000 and 1.2 million illegal migrants presently living in Britain. The rest of the paper takes that 1.2 million as gospel. There are other estimates out there. Wait, let me finish. Can I finish, please?
Let him finish. I promise you will come back.
Can I finish, Rob? Because I'm trying to make my point here. And yes, you're right. There's lots of uncertainty. There are other estimates out there you could have used. You could have chosen a range. You could have done that. You didn't. And my question, and my point again is simple. Why should we take any of the fabricated statistics that you throw around seriously when you won't even say whether you knew when you published this paper that Pew had already withdrawn the 1.2 million? In other words, whether you simply didn't bother to do the basic research required, or whether you were lying. That's all I want to know. And it's all I think we should.
as you literally read out verbatim, research suggests, and then we gave a range of 400,000 individuals, a scope of between 800,000 and 1.2 million. And again,
in other words, not the estimate which Pew actually have published.
Okay, we'll come back to this, but I just want to give you an
Sure.
opportunity to ask Jonathan a question.
Well, I came in with the questioning a bit more good faith rather than some sort of really niche issue. So I was going to ask Jonathan whether it's the sort of non-existent care homes that are sponsoring visas, whether it's those foreign students that are coming in to study woodwork and wardrobe design at low-grade universities, or whether it's the tens of thousands of adult dependents that have come to the country under the last government's immigration system and aren't working. Which would you say was the biggest policy failure of the last government's immigration policy?
Of the last government's immigration policy, I think it's fair to say that the care visa was in significant respects a failure. I should note that the vast majority of people who came under that visa are working, because we know that from the very, and they are paying tax, they're being employed, because we know that their employers are reporting the fact that they're employed, the fact that they're paying tax, the fact that their average earnings are actually surprisingly not that different from people already in the care sector to HMRC. So we know that overall most of these people are working and contributing to the care sector. But we also do know that there was significant, as you're correct in saying, fraud and abuse perpetrated by, as you say, fictional care homes or dodgy employment agencies, that the previous government did belatedly realize that and restrict the giving sponsor licenses to people in that sector. This government has carried on with that. I think obviously in any system, just as the fact that there is some relatively low level of fraud in the disability benefit system doesn't mean that everyone on disability benefits, or indeed that only more than a small minority of people on disability benefits are scroungers or fakes, doesn't mean the immigration system on the whole doesn't work very reasonably well, and that most people here who come on work visas are working legitimately. But yes, I think the care visa was a significant policy failure in some respects. I think that's a fair point.
And just sticking on the point about the care visas, we sometimes, or a lot of times, we hear things like immigration is saving the NHS and social care and so on. There was a recent BBC headline that literally said how migrants are saving the NHS from crisis. And it gives the impression that immigration is not just helpful, but indispensable in this regard. But when you look a bit closely, you can see that the picture might be a bit more complicated. So recruitment from abroad is very expensive, and you still have to train them. So I understand, people say actually people in this country, they don't find the care industry very respectable, low wages and so on. But shouldn't we just consistently place more emphasis in getting that right instead of relying on immigration abroad? And I was watching an interview, or listening to an interview on LBC, and someone who came here as a migrant to work under the care visa, he basically admitted that he and many people he knew actually left the care industry as soon as they got their 5 years to stay in this country. Because what people may not realize, that if these jobs are not desirable for the so-called native population, so to speak, then they may not be desirable for those who come here, who may find greener pastures in due time. What would you say to that, Jonathan? Sorry.
Is that from
yes,
me or
Jonathan? Both of you.
Yeah.
Speak,
So I think there's quite a lot of points there, and not surprising, since of course the NHS is the country's largest employer, and there are a lot of people in the care system who don't work for the NHS. On the care system, I think there's general consensus that the country as a whole would be in a better place if we paid care workers more, we treated them better, they had better career paths, and that if that were achieved, then we would be able to reduce reliance on migration. That has been consensus in principle among both experts and in principle politicians for a number of years. The reason it hasn't happened hasn't got much to do with migration. It has to do with the reluctance of politicians to say to the public, you are going to have to, if you want to improve pay and conditions in the care sector, you're going to have to pay for it. And that means either higher taxes, or that people in care and their relatives have to pay more. Do I think that would be a good thing? Yes. On the other hand, I'm not standing for election. But we need to put the horse before the cart here. The thing if you want to reduce low migration in the care sector, we do broadly know how to do it. And we do broadly think that would be a good thing in the long run. But somebody's going to have to pay for it. And politicians are going to have to tell the public that they have to pay for it if that's what people want.
Robert, do you have anything to say on the back of that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say I think you made a really good point about those individuals that come on to work in the care sector. I think what we'll see at the beginning of next year is that those individuals that came in on a care visa, once they get that indefinite leave to remain status, will increasingly go elsewhere in the labour market. So the idea that immigration is going to be the means through which we solve the shortages in the healthcare sector is in the care sector rather is a bit pie in the sky thinking. Of course, when the visa was actually introduced, the vacancies in that sector was about 100,000. We then handed out roughly 400,000 visas in that area, and actually the vacancies increased to 130,000. So it's done very little to actually deal with those systemic issues that both of you have mentioned. And, Jonathan, I do agree with you that people are going to have to pay with it. But I think if the trade-off is reducing immigration by reducing our reliance on overseas labour to fill the care sector, then I think people would be quite happy to. I mean, some estimates say that it could really be done with 1 billion extra expenditure a year, maybe 2 billion. That's because down at that bottom end of the kind of labour market with the wages, individuals are a lot more susceptible to small increases per hour, 40p here, 50p there. And, if you get a care home and then there's an Amazon warehouse that opens next door, or a Sainsbury's supermarket paying 50p more per hour, then you're going to have people thinking twice before entering into the care sector. So I think it is something that we've become too reliant on just pulling that lever of immigration. And I think if we actually just sort of politicians swallowed their pride a bit and we were prepared to stump up the necessary capital, I think it would actually do a lot more to address those systemic underlying problems, which even the MAC, the Migration Advisory Committee, recognises. It recognises that immigration isn't going to be the silver bullet to solve the problems in the care sector. It actually needs other tinkering in the labour market as well.
I mean, I broadly agree with Robert said, but I would make, one point. First of all, that asking for an extra 2 billion on council tax bills is not something politicians are willing to do at the moment. I tend to agree that they should, but I don't think it's not necessarily. It's relatively easy for those of us who actually don't have to stand for election to say that. But on public opinion, as I said, most experts are actually pretty, including relatively pro-migration people who favor a relatively liberal policy like me, are pretty down on the care visa. The public is not. If you ask the public, who should we let in? Should we have more care workers or fewer? We've got very good polling evidence on this from Rob Ford and others, which is actually the public is very relaxed about people coming here to work in the care sector and thinks that there should be more of them. Same for the NHS.
What was the question? What was the result of that polling?
Should we have more? Should we have more people coming here from abroad to work in the care sector or fewer people? And this is true.
Sorry.
This is true of pretty much all the public opinion polling on immigration, by the way, which is that if you ask people what do they want immigration to fall, they say yes. If you ask them, should we have more nurses and doctors, they say yes, please. If they say, should we have more care workers, they say yes, please. The only category where the public unequivocally says we should have fewer people among the sort of legal migration routes is bankers. So the public really doesn't like bankers, despite the fact that economists like me, we might still dislike bankers, but we sort of have to grudgingly concede that they're probably fiscally positive by any possible measure.
Jonathan, did you have another question for Robert?
I probably took up enough time on the first one, so I'm happy to go with.
Okay, Robert, do you have a question for?
I have another one. Yeah, it was Labour are basically right, aren't they? That indefinite leave to remain, the period before an individual can get indefinite leave to remain, needs to be at the very least extended, if not scrapped altogether. And I was just wondering if you could actually spell out to people what the advantages of giving settled status to foreign nationals is, and if you could do that without talking about the integration of those foreign nationals, because frankly, that's a meaningless concept at this point that's been so diluted with different angles from which it's been approached that it has no real solid foundation.
We give indefinite leave to remain to people after about 5 years, and that is merely a sort of for lots of people, a very brief transit point before they have eligibility for citizenship. So we essentially should see indefinite leave to remain as sort of pre-citizenship for people who want to become British citizens, which is most people who are not debarred from doing so by various sort of nationality or tax concerns, which is true of a minority, but not for most people. So, should we give a path to citizenship for people who've been for 5 years? You can argue about what the right number. 5 years is roughly comparable to other advanced economies. Some countries do it sooner. Some countries take longer. Countries which do it sooner tend to have better outcomes overall. We have a lot of good evidence that giving people access to settlement and citizenship is good for integration, both from a social point of view and an economic point of view. They do better in the labour market and they become more integrated. And we have good polling evidence, again, Rob Ford has done this, that shows that most British people think that 5 years or less is a reasonable time. Even, Rob found, a majority of reform voters don't favour extending the period beyond 5 years. So it is, there is no particular right answer, but both the economic evidence, the evidence on integration and cohesion, and what the British public actually thinks all suggest that the period of 5 years is certainly not too short, and arguably for some people at least too long, because we do actually want most people who stay here a reasonable amount of time and intend to stay here for longer to become British, to integrate. And that, of course, is what the vast majority of people do. I would actually use this opportunity to throw back a question, because this has sort of prompted them. I mean, Robert, you said, you've basically endorsed the line by Matt Goodwin and others that they're not enough, that the fact that the white British population is diminishing means that we are becoming less integrated, less cohesive, less of a country. You said something about, that British is not a piece of paper, that the fact that the white British are becoming minorities is eroding the sense of self of these islands. So, just out of interest, do you think people who are Black British or Asian British, people who are often born here, are different in terms of how British they are, that they don't contribute to the sense of self? What distinction would you draw? Why do you draw a distinction between, say, me and, say, Ada here, who I'm guessing, you correct me if I'm wrong, is A, Black, B, British, C, born in the UK?
Okay, Robert?
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, so I wasn't born in the UK, no. I'm British Nigerian.
Right. But you have a British passport.
Yeah.
Which Robert says is just a piece of paper. It doesn't mean you're really British.
So I think it's more than that. So when it comes to, first of all, the indefinite leave to remain, basically there is no actual virtue for the British population by awarding indefinite leave to remain on the scale we are doing. It literally just leads to situations, as we've seen with the data now, of billions of pounds going every single year to foreign nationals. It's effectively just a means through which individuals can effectively take more largesse from the British state rather than actually giving anything extra back. I personally think that the indefinite leave to remain phenomenon is something which is way past its time. It was introduced in the 1970s when net migration was actually in the negatives. It was running about negative 40,000 the year it was introduced. It was not in any way prepared or designed for the scale of the grants that we are currently seeing of indefinite leave to remain. I think it is basically a kind of peculiar anteroom which allows individuals to claim benefits for their children to become British citizens and to effectively shop around the job market to find something that suits their fancy, whether or not it benefits the British population. So I think that's it's an outdated concept that I'd be quite happy to see the back of. When it comes to the Goodwin report, I think the really important point that we need to take from that is that for about 7,000 years, the sort of ancestry of this country, these islands, were relatively stable until very recently. 3/4 of the population could trace their lineage back to 7,000 years ago. Those hunter-gatherers when they arrived here. So I think the point is that it's such a rapid change over less than 100 years or so, in which the stability of the population, the kind of sense of inheriting something from your forebears, the sense of being the sort of torchbearers of a common story. I think it's very difficult to have that if you have a population which does not have a core sense of itself. And I think that's the case not just for those that are sort of Brits of several generations, but also those that are looking to come to the UK and then try and assimilate into the culture. I think it's increasingly hard if you arrive in a country and you don't actually know what the predominant culture or the predominant norms emanating from a certain group are. And I think it really actually leads to a situation where society will become increasingly fragmented, because of course, whilst the white Britons might be sort of, roughly 40% in the 2060s, that doesn't mean that the remaining 60% are all one homogenous group either. I think what we'll see actually is an increasing kind of segregation of society. We're already seeing a lot of inter-community conflict on the streets of Britain, and I think if we allow ourselves to get to a situation where individuals are allowed to silo themselves away from each other, it's not really the kind of thing into which you can go and fight and tell yourselves a common story about.
So you're saying that London, which is already only about 40% white British, is rife with interethnic conflict, with self-segregation, and you draw a distinction between white British people and black British people, like Ada.
No, I don't. It's not a distinction in terms of ethnicity. It's a distinction. You're trying to put words into my mouth because you've got a common ethnicity. Sort of set of.
White British is an ethnicity. That's its definition.
But it's not that.
And you just said
no value attachment to white British ethnicity. It's simply a recognition that for thousands of years these islands were inhabited by white Britons, and that those that are white British are very likely to be the descendants of individuals that have lived on these islands for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So I think the point with the Matt Goodwin report, which I think a lot of people actually understand but have chosen not to for point scoring because they like to sort of hint or ban that R word around because it kind of makes them feel like they're in control of the argument, is that it's the scale of the change, it's the churn of the population in which people don't actually have that same level of attachment that you would do if you were in a place. And I'm not saying this is the case on an individual level, I'm saying this is the case on a scale. You wouldn't have that same sense of attachment to the country in which you live if you are, say, in some instances, a second generation migrant. You just simply haven't got the same lineage, you haven't got the family tree that you can follow back. So look, you can try and put words into my mouth, Matt Goodwin's mouth, but the simple fact of the matter is that the scale of the population change and the scale of the makeup is unlike anything that these islands have ever seen. And I think going forward, we don't know, there's no precedent for an experiment on this scale. We don't know what the consequences of that would be. You point to London, I would argue that, you go around places like Tower Hamlets and you see the Bengali on Whitechapel, you'd already start to see people taking themselves into their own sects rather than walking along the street and seeing each other as one another and part of a common nationality.
I mean, as everybody says at this point in the conversation, have you actually walked down Brick Lane lately? Are you remotely serious? Do you actually live in London or understand what London is like?
To Robert's point, I live in a part of the UK that it is highly predominantly South Asian. And you can tell that there is a different cultural landscape here than, for example, let's say in Rugby Town, where I've lived as well. So isn't it important, Jonathan, that people take these concerns of the rapid and sort of how quick things are changing in a short space of time? Because if political leaders or and so on, if they don't take these issues and these grievances seriously and just dismiss it as it's racist or xenophobic or ethno-nationalist, then we will see these things erupt in our streets, because of course with large levels of migration, you do import different societies. You're not importing British or English people. There are people coming from all over the world. It doesn't mean that their cultures are lesser or better, but it is different. And then what might happen is that that one society erodes, and what you now have is different micro societies, different ideas of not really different ideas of right or wrong, but there's no sort of agreement in a sense of how we share this space together in a sense, and that's why you have things like high crime in some areas, because people feel like they don't owe their neighbor the same level of restraint or respect as in their home country. What would you say to people who have these kinds of thoughts and ideas?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say that we have to separate out some of the reasonable concerns which you've raised and the straightforward, what is racist ethno-nationalism. Let's be absolutely clear about it, about saying that there is some sort of problem because there are not enough white British people and there are too many people like you of British Nigerian descent, or too many people like me, although funnily enough, usually Robert and the Matt Goodwins of this country don't tend to focus on people like me, but I'm Jewish, my parents are immigrants. By the metric that these people use, Goodwin and Kizine, I am not allowed to call myself English, right? That's explicitly what they said. So we should be absolutely clear that, and you're not allowed to call yourself English either, Ada. Wrong colour. I'm wrong religion. We should be absolutely clear that that is racist ethno-nationalism, and I don't think we should be at all shy of making absolutely clear that's what it is, and we should do our best to ensure that it is treated as offensive, because the vast majority of British people, and there's again ample polling evidence on this, very large, the vast majority of people living here saying that if you're British, you're British. If you were born here, if you have a British passport, you are British, and that's irrespective of whether you're black or white, Jewish, Hindu or Christian. Most people do not buy this ethno-nationalist nonsense. Now, your concerns the concerns you've raised, some of them are entirely legitimate. And we have, again, a lot of data and evidence on this, and the data and evidence on this, the UK is pretty good on this, right? So we are a less segregated country than we were 10 years ago. And that country 10 years ago was less segregated than it was 10 years before, right? We have that data. We have detailed data from the census on where people live, especially true in London. And, more diverse places tend to be more integrated and less segregated. So to take Tower Hamlets, for example, it's more diverse than it was. That is to say, it's less Bangladeshi and more lots of other groups than it was 10 years ago, because for various complicated social reasons. So you can go look around any of these places. We also have data on other indicators of social integration. So, for example, Matt Goodwin deliberately, of course, in his data sort of assumed that we all stayed in our separate groups. So he sort of assumed the answer he wanted, which was that we all stayed segregated. He didn't like the idea of Muslims marrying non-Muslims, for example. So he just excluded that possibility from his future projections, right? Because why would you assume, despite the fact that, of course, in my own social circle, there's lots of interethnic relationships. There's lots of relationships across religions. That's true of almost anybody who lives in London and doesn't choose to live in an ethno-nationalist bubble. So if you're Matt Goodwin, of course, you just assume these things don't happen. But actually, that's the way this country works. That doesn't mean that there aren't lots of problems, as you suggest. It doesn't mean that we haven't got a lot of challenges on integration. But we have also a fair amount of evidence that, on average, overall, we are a more integrated society. We're a society that's much more comfortable with ethnic differences than we used to be.
What about what would you say about studies that have been done that shows that the more a society is culturally diverse, it shows that there are lower levels of social trust between ethnic groups?
Well, that was a famous American study. We tried to replicate that here. Indeed, the Migration Advisory Committee commissioned a study, and indeed there was another study commissioned by Buddy too. They essentially found that result doesn't really hold for the UK. So, as I said, countries are different.
Would you say anything about that, Robert?
No, I was just sitting back watching Jonathan talking about bogeymen of ethno-nationalists and throwing around every insult over the... Surprised it took us 30 minutes to get to that point, really, but there we go now. Look, it doesn't take a absolute genius to realise that the more that the differences between individuals living in a society are pronounced, and they are pronounced still. Jonathan is very good at doing this, saying that there's lots of data, but they're never actually giving any citation, and very good at floating this idea, and he's Googling it right now, I can see.
I referred you to the census on the segregation measures. It's not hard to look up. I know you're not very good at this, Robert, but
So go on, spell that out. Well, first of all, I would just say it's been something that's been pretty well known since the days of Aristotle that a society that's more divided is not likely to have the same strengths, the same social trust, the same social capital, where society where if you are walking down the street, you are likely to be walking past individuals that you know have similar outlooks, similar sort of familial histories as yourself. And that, again, it's probably not Jonathan's strength to appreciate these kind of things, these softer things, as he's a kind of data man, apparently. These are the kind of things that actually are very hard to model and very hard to pick up on, but they are very palpable. I mean, the fact that we have 1 million individuals in this country that speak little to no English, the fact that we are the Sharia law court capital of the world. The fact that we have increasing calls for effective blasphemy law. The fact that we have chants for intifada on the streets of Britain. All of these would suggest to me that actually, rather than us becoming a society where we're increasingly recognising the same rules, the same norms, we're starting to go our own separate ways already.
Well, I think Robert gave it away. When you walk past people and you know they don't have the same familial selection, he's essentially saying that, yeah, when he has a problem walking past black and Asian people. That's fine. That's true of some people. It's fortunately only true of a minority of people here. So, yes, of course, divided societies are more divided. But it's Robert who's choosing to divide on the basis of ethnicity, which is actually not, in my view, the most important division in the UK. I'm still an old-fashioned social democrat who thinks that economics matters rather more.
No judgment attached to ethnicity. It is simply noting the scale of change, and it's simply noting that the more you have populations that are separate from a core
You just said you were uncomfortable walking past a black person because they don't share your family history in this country. I mean, you literally said that, so...
I didn't.
He did.
Couldn't even begin and divine my thoughts on that.
Familial history.
Okay.
When you walk past someone and you realise they don't show the familial history. Well, the only reason how do I know that I don't show my familial history with Ada exactly?
Okay, I will move on from this point only just because we've literally done today an episode on civic and civic versus ethnic nationalism. So a lot of things are sort of repeating itself in this conversation, and I don't want things to overlap. But I just have one question for both of you.